Rockets fans, welcome to the Rockets Launch Pod, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets. Whoa! Sports Talk 790. Rockets. 3 to go! Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Rockets Launch Pod starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here. This is the Rockets Launch Pod presented by Clutch Fans. It's Wednesday, July 1st, and within the first 24 hours of the NBA's 2026 offseason free agency window, the Rockets, as expected, have a couple of veteran additions to their roster. The deal that had been rumored for a few days with Marcus Smart is now done. 2 years at the taxpayer mid-level exception, which will pay him $13 million. He will have a player option after next season. And then to further fortify the bench, you've got Bogdan Bogdanović, the sharpshooter most recently with the LA Clippers. For his career, he shot threes at above 38% in the NBA. He agreed to a deal at the veteran's minimum salary. Both of those happening within the first 24 hours of free agency, which tells you that they were priorities for the Rockets. And I'll go through both basketball and business-wise what some of the considerations were in today's breaking news episode. And for clarity, it's just me on this one. I'll have a full show with Paolo Alves in a few days. So let's start with Marcus Smart, which is clearly the acquisition of more significance. It had been rumored for a few days, and I'll talk more about the business side today because in our archives, you can find me and Paolo's show from a couple of days ago. We explored the basketball considerations. So I'm going to talk more about the contract today. But off the top, obviously, let's at least acknowledge the basketball because that's the primary motivation for the deal. I'm going to quote a couple of tweets from Adam Spolane, longtime media member covering the Rockets, who I think summed it up very well. Marcus Smart will help the Rockets defensively, and he gives them another ball handler, which they desperately needed last season. He doesn't address the Rockets' need for shooting, but he does play with a fearlessness that they've lacked, and that will rub off on others. Think of Marcus Smart as an older, smaller Dillon Brooks who can dribble but can't shoot. I think that's a pretty good comparison. For all the talk that's been out there about the Rockets needing to shoot better from three, and hopefully Bogdan can help with that, we'll get to him momentarily, that was not the only need on last season's roster. The 52-30 Rockets, who lost in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs for a second straight year, were not just one or two 40% three-point shooters from being at the level of the Spurs or the Thunder. There are multiple things that they need to improve this team. Shooting is an obvious one, and I think the lack of shooting and the effect on spacing, it can sometimes drive fans up the wall because it's so noticeable. But there are other parts of the game as well. And if you really paid attention to this team last season, they never replaced what Dillon Brooks gave them 2 years ago. They never had the same defensive intensity, the consistency night in, night out. The formula had eroded. They had hoped that Dorian Finney-Smith would help them replace Dillon Brooks. That didn't happen because he wasn't healthy. Marcus Smart, he is smaller, but because he is so physical, even though he's technically a 6'3" or 6'4" guard, he's so thick, he's so physical, he can guard 1 through 4. We saw in the playoffs, he even guarded Alperen Şengün in the post at times and had success. So to me, this is their best physical point of attack defender since Dillon Brooks. They never replaced that role, and while certainly the Kevin Durant trade helped you offensively and gave you a dimension, at least in the regular season when he was available, that you didn't have the previous year, there was a hit defensively. The hope was that DFS would mitigate the impact of that, but he wasn't available. This is take two. This is their second attempt at backfilling that Dillon Brooks role. And it's why, folks asked why they triggered the first apron hard cap a year ago, which, by the way, they did not with the Marcus Smart signing. But to go back 1 year, folks were asking, especially in hindsight, when the Rockets were capped out and couldn't really make any moves to upgrade the team during the season, why did the Rockets spend the non-taxpayer mid-level to implement that hard cap that was so restrictive? The reason they did it was they knew the Dillon role was that important in the grand scheme if they wanted to win in the short term. Unfortunately, DFS simply was not the right guy to fill that because he wasn't healthy. But I do understand why they triggered the first apron hard cap. It's because backfilling Dillon Brooks was that important to the formula, especially with how Ime Udoka wants to play. Marcus Smart on paper has an ability to do that. Now, you never know. He is going to turn 33 years old next season, so maybe this is the year his game declines some, or maybe he has an unfortunate injury. Things can happen, but this is not like the DFS signing where he had surgery earlier in the offseason. According to everything we know, Marcus Smart is healthy. He looked great in the playoffs, and I think defensively he'll be important getting back to that formula they had a couple of years ago when they were a much better and more consistent defensive team. And then the ball handling. I've had a lot of folks ask, does this show that Fred VanVleet might be on the way out? Not necessarily. I mean, it certainly could. It provides you with more options, but the reception to Amen Thompson and Reed Shepherd at point guard this past year, I would say, was mixed at best. Now, I would point out that both of those guys are very young, and you could expect them to improve with time, especially with their decision-making and processing. But regardless, right here, right now, are they ready to be, quote-unquote, traditional point guards in the NBA? I don't know. It's fair to wonder about that. So Marcus Smart provides more insurance there with ball handling and decision-making. And then this past year, anytime someone responded by saying, oh, Fred VanVleet's going to come back next year and that'll help you at the point guard position, the obvious follow-up question was, well, how healthy is Fred going to be? This gives you some insurance for Fred as well. If he's limited early in the year, or if maybe he can't play back-to-back, something like that, when training camp opens, he'll be 12 months removed from ACL surgery. So I think he'll be cleared. It's just, can he go immediately back to what he did before the injury, i.e. playing 30-plus minutes per game, being available throughout the year, including back-to-backs? I don't know. It's case by case with ACLs. It is a major injury. And so if you're nervous about being too dependent on Fred, then I think Marcus provides some valuable insurance there as well. But I think the bigger thing is certainly the defensive end of the court. And I just think it's easy for that to get overlooked because especially if your team doesn't shoot well, that's so glaring. But the defensive fall off, if you pay attention to this team, that was pretty glaring as well. So I'm not going to sit here and say they should have signed Luke Kennard. Let's use him as an example because he got basically the identical deal with the Suns that Marcus Smart did with the Rockets. Luke Kennard is a better shooter and he would fill that specific need more. But I think Marcus Smart is clearly, assuming health, a better overall player. I think that was represented in the Lakers-Rockets playoff series that we saw. By the way, Marcus Smart, even though he's 32 years old, the analytics love the guy. I've seen some metrics that have put him in the top 10 most impactful defenders last season. On-off differential, he was the best on the entire Lakers roster. In the playoffs, he took it to another level against the Rockets. And in terms of three-point shooting, he, in the playoffs, was at 34%, averaged more than 5 assists per game, limited turnovers, averaged about 2.5 steals as well. So in terms of controlling possessions and at least being a respectable shooter when open, he did that, and he stepped up when the lights were at their brightest. So I just think from a basketball perspective, this makes a lot of sense. There's the obvious connection with Ime Udoka going back to their time together in Boston. That's actually when Marcus was Defensive Player of the Year in the 2021 to 22 season. I don't think he's quite that guy anymore that he was in his late 20s, but he's still very, very good, and he should help this team. And this is a relatively small contract. We're talking about $6.5 million a year on average. Folks, the minimum salary for a veteran of Marcus's age is like $3 million. So to get what Marcus Smart can give you, just go back and look at those Rockets-Lakers games in the playoffs for just a little bit above the minimum salary. It's a good deal. I like it. It's not going to fill every hole for this team. No, It doesn't make them on paper at the level of the Spurs or the Thunder, but it makes them a better team than they were a year ago for sure. And that's why I have a tough time complaining about this deal. Now, let's look at specifically the business side. I think the basketball, it should be pretty obvious. Assuming health, Marcus is going to help this team. It's the business case where, yeah, there are some other options, and you always should be doing your due diligence. If you're not truly at a championship level, which I don't think the Rockets are, then there's multiple factors that you've got to weigh. The biggest thing here, and I made the case on my Twitter timeline at Ben DuBose, I put together a thread of thoughts. By doing the 2-year, $13 million deal with the player option, that's the taxpayer MLE. That's not the non-taxpayer, which had been reported. The rumors were 3 years at $21 million. To give a deal longer than 2 years would have required the non-taxpayer, and using the non-taxpayer would have hard capped the Rockets at the first apron. That's for next season, $209 million in total team salary. That's exactly what cost them so much a year ago, being hard capped at the first apron. It was very restrictive. The taxpayer mid-level exception hard caps you at the second apron, which is $222 million. So by doing a shorter deal with Marcus Smart, you got $13 million in extra flexibility, which is very useful for being able to retain Tari Eason, who's now a restricted free agent. If you had triggered the first apron hard cap, the Rockets would have been $13 million at this current moment beneath it. And so if any team with cap space had offered Tari a deal at higher than $13 million in year one, the Rockets would have had to move salaries to accommodate that. Whereas now you have $26 million in space. The Rockets' total team payroll is estimated today at about $196 million. You can very easily fit in and match any reasonable offer that Tari gets, and probably have room left over to sign Bruce Thornton, the rookie you just drafted out of Ohio State, as well, and still be beneath that $222 million. And you won't have to offload any salary like Dorian Finney-Smith that could be useful to help you with bigger trades down the line. It just gives you considerably more options. Now, theoretically, if some team cleared cap space and offered more than $26 million per year to Tari Eason, you would have to, as things currently stand, shed some salaries to have room in that scenario. But I'm not sure. I love Tari, but I'm not sure at that point if the Rockets, if it would even be in their interest to match on Tari if somehow he was getting paid more than $26 million. So that $26 million buffer that they have right now, I think that's a very realistic ceiling for what they match with Tari, because anything above that, I just don't think that would be responsible. And I don't think, my personal expectation is that it won't even be that close to 26. I think if cooler heads prevail, I think you can probably get Tari for something in the, $17, $18 million a year range in terms of average annual value, a little bit above the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. If they can't come to terms, I do think the qualifying offer of $8 million is in play, in which case you have even more of a buffer relative to that second apron hard cap. But the point is, you've got much more flexibility this way, and that's why the Rockets agreed to a deal on these terms. Had they gone the other path, and if you listen to our show earlier in the week with Paolo, he was on board with the 3-year, $21 million structure that had been rumored. That was basically the same annual value, but over a longer period of time and without a player option. In a vacuum, that's better because it gives you more stability moving forward with Marcus Smart. However, the reason I prefer this is that it's not just about Marcus Smart. It's about how he fits in the bigger puzzle. And this just gives you considerably more outs. And let's run through the worst case scenario. So the reason you don't want a short-term deal, especially in today's NBA where you won't have bird rights after one season, is that the player is conceivably a flight risk. Folks, think it through. If Marcus Smart goes out next year and is so good that he prices you out, if at 33 years old his market is so robust a year from now that you're not able to retain him, that's a good problem to have, because in his mid 30s, for Marcus Smart to have that kind of market leverage to where you can't use an exception to retain him, that means he had a phenomenal season, and probably in the playoffs as well, because at his age, he's got to do it under the bright lights to really make an impact around the league. If Marcus Smart is so good this year that he prices you out, folks, that's a good problem to have, because you probably had a fantastic season as a team. It probably means you won at least one playoff series, because he would need the sample size to really stand out. To me, if that quote unquote worst case scenario plays out, that's an acceptable trade-off. So yes, for Marcus Smart alone, a longer term deal, which you could have gotten with the non-taxpayer and probably avoid the player option, it would give you more certainty with him moving forward. But the shorter term deal, it gives you more options to fill out your roster. And the only way that he would truly be out of play if you want to retain him a year from now would be if he's so good that you probably had a phenomenal year as a team. For me, that's an acceptable trade-off, and that's why I think the Rockets did it this way. Now, you can also argue, as Paolo did, that maybe you should be using the tools you have available this offseason to create an asset. Someone younger that, especially if they're willing to sign for multiple years, that you could use in trades down the line, or they might have more upside. To me, that's a bigger picture conversation to have, and I'm not going to make a mountain out of a molehill with a salary as low as the taxpayer mid-level exception. To me, you've got to play in the sandbox or within the sandbox that you choose to be in. That's how I phrased it on our show earlier in the week. And if you're largely staying the course with a 38-year-old Kevin Durant and an all-star Alperen Şengün and an all-star level player in Amin Thompson, if you're largely staying the course, that's inherently about winning in the short term. Now, can they actually win a title relative to how good the Spurs and Thunder look on paper? I don't know. We've had recent shows questioning that, and if the Rockets should make bigger picture changes, be it with the fit or the timeline, to give them a better shot to have a championship ceiling. That's a fair conversation, but I'm not going to expect the taxpayer mid-level exception to think that it can or should be used along those lines if the far bigger picture considerations aren't in alignment. If you want me to think in terms of assets and future optionality and upside and years down the line, then okay, I'd be fine using the MLE in a different way. But to me, it seems sort of pointless to use the MLE along those lines while you're still sticking with the model from last season and the very highly paid players that are currently on your roster. I just think you need to be in alignment, and I understand where Paolo's coming from on that, but I just don't think it's compatible with the way they're managing the rest of the roster. And if you want to question whether that management is appropriate, you certainly can, but I think it's better to have that conversation about the bigger names than it is a relatively small potatoes, $6 million a year taxpayer mid-level exception signing. And then I guess the only other argument you could make, to me, that's why you don't go, young and thinking of it in terms of assets and upside. I guess you can argue, well, you could have signed a similar player, but on a 2-year deal without the player option. Well, in that scenario, I think you're probably taking a lower class of player. I think Marcus Smart is probably the best you can do for that amount of money. And so because he's the best you can do, he has the leverage to get a player option after year one if he goes out there and plays well and is clearly above the value of his contract, to then go out and negotiate a new contract a year from now. A player who would accept a straight 2-year deal without a player option inherently doesn't have the resume of Marcus Smart, because he doesn't have the leverage to get that player option. So again, it just comes down to what your priorities are. If we're thinking in terms of assets and long-term and the future, then yeah, you could do something different either with, the taxpayer MLE going to the non-taxpayer and having a 3 or 4 year deal. Yeah, there's definitely different paths. But what I think Marcus Smart provides you, and he had the leverage to get this structure, is the best win now piece for that amount of money. And you can certainly question if that's the direction that the Rockets should go. But again, I think that's a far bigger conversation than just this taxpayer MLA. To me, you've got to play within the sandbox that you choose to be in. This seems to be the sandbox that the Rockets have chosen, and I wish them well. Like, obviously, I want them to win games, and I will say, look, last year they had almost everything go wrong that reasonably could go wrong, and they still went 52-30. Now, if they're relatively healthy next year and you bring back Fred VanVleet and Steven Adams, and now you add Marcus Smart and Bogdan Bogdanović, yeah, you're better than the team you were a season ago, at least on paper. Now, are you at the level of the Spurs or the Thunder who won 60 plus and looked great in the Western Conference Finals? I don't know, but you're definitely better. And I think, at least in the short term, we can celebrate that. And maybe it just buys you some time. I think one thing that should definitely be underscored here, that additional buffer by having the second apron hard cap and not the first apron hard cap, it should allow you to keep your salary fillers on your roster if that's what you want to do. And the guys I'm referring to as salary fillers are Dorian Finney-Smith and Clint Capella, because they make about $20 million combined between them, even though right now I don't think they would project to be in your day one rotation, assuming everyone is healthy. That gives you options. You can play out more than half of the season and reevaluate at the trade deadline. And at that point, by the way, Dorian Finney-Smith's expiring salary will be more than half paid off. So he'll almost be at a human TPE, traded player exception, at that point. This gives you the optionality to get more data. It allows you to buy more time. And then you can take stock of where you are in the Western Conference and relative to those other teams midway through next season. I'm not saying you have to do that. If the bigger deal is available now or at some point later in the offseason, of course you can strike while the iron is hot and do something sooner rather than later. But this also allows you to buy time if that's what you want to do. So for the obvious questions of, well, you're better than last year, but how much better? Well, this path does allow you to get another half season or so of data before making more of a definitive conclusion. And then if you feel like you need a reset by the midway point of next season, if it's becoming quite obvious that you're just not at that tier of the Spurs or the Thunder and none of your young guys are taking clear steps forward to where they might can be something close to the alpha on a contender, you can take that strategic step back if that's what you think you need to do, or maybe sell high on a 38-year-old Kevin Durant who might have more value elsewhere on a team that is, with KD on the roster, more ready to compete at the highest level. With this path, you do have the ability to buy more time. And I think there's clear value there. Finally, the last point I would make with regards to the business of all this, a lot of the trades that have been thrown out on Rockets Twitter and all the social media and message board platforms that I've seen don't take into account roster slots. And I'll use one as an example. Folks are asking about the Kyrie Irving situation in Dallas because he seems to be an awkward fit for a Dallas team that's building around a 19 or 20-year-old Cooper Flag, and Kyrie, is coming off an ACL repair, and he's, I believe, 33 or 34 years old himself. So how much sense does he make if Dallas isn't ready to win at a high level right now? I mean, that's a fair question. His value would just depreciate in all likelihood over the coming years. And so people have pointed out that you can combine the salaries of Fred and DFS and be almost right on the nose with Kyrie's $39 million salary for next season. That's true. And Fred doesn't have a no trade clause, as we covered when he opted in a few days ago. But you would then still have to fill out your roster. So even though the trade on the trade machine would show you, yeah, Fred and DFS for Kyrie, that's almost picture perfect. Well, you then have to sign someone to fill that second roster spot. And even if it's a minimum signing, if it's a veterans minimum, that's almost $3 million. So you're looking at, it's not just 39 million for 39 million. In terms of the total payroll, it's closer to 42 million for 39, and even more than that if you're trying to do a 3-for-1 type deal, because you then have to backfill multiple roster spots. And where that gets tricky is if you are hard capped at the first apron, well, you might not even be able to keep DFS on your books at all, because you'd potentially need to offload him to make room for Tari Eason, as we were just describing. But even if you were, it would be tough to aggregate salaries, because the backfilling would probably put you over the first apron if you were that close and have that limited amount of buffer. That was a problem this past season as well. This path on paper, unless Tari gets close to $26 million, and I don't see where he's going to have the leverage to get that, you should have buffer to combine salaries for a bigger name and then backfill the open roster spots with minimum guys and still stay beneath that second apron hard cap. Now, that does require, one thing to watch. Will the Rockets be willing to continue paying Dorian Finney-Smith to basically be potential salary filler in trades? That's a fair question. Last year was the first time that Tillman Fertitta has paid the luxury tax as an owner, so how aggressive is he willing to be to spend if it's unclear that the team can actually win a championship this year? I mean, we'll see. Maybe they end up dumping DFS anyway for the tax savings. But on paper, there's a path now to keeping DFS and having considerably more options to build out your roster and potentially even make bigger moves later in the offseason or in the trade deadline window during this upcoming season. So that's the other part of this. To me, you combine all of that, I think the path the Rockets chose, which is the taxpayer MLE and giving yourself a hard salary cap at the second apron, $222 million relative to the 209 of the first apron hard cap, to me, it's clearly worth it. When the only real trade-off, Marcus Smart has a player option now next offseason, and, normally the Rockets don't like to give out player options. I don't think in this case it's a big deal at all, like just from a philosophical standpoint, because the number is so small. Where it could be a big deal is if he exercises it and then leaves you for no compensation. But if that's the case, if he plays well enough to put himself into a much higher financial bracket, then if that's the trade-off, it means he had one hell of a season, probably in the playoffs as well, and that's a great result for the team. And if that somehow happens, I think you tip your hat to him, you say thank you, it was a great year, and you try and see what's next, but it was probably a clear step forward for the team. So for me, if that's the trade-off, I think it's clearly worth it. It gives you more options, and so basketball-wise, I get it. Business-wise, I get it as well. I think within the sandbox, to go back to that analogy, within the sandbox that they've chosen to put themselves in, this makes a lot of sense. If we want to question the sandbox, we certainly can, but I'll personally save that for later in the offseason. Let's see what else they do as far as putting this roster together, any trades they make or don't make. They should have options now, as I've been describing, and, let's see what the roster looks like closer to training camp. Let's see what it looks like if they do largely stay the course about midway through next season as we get to the trade deadline window. Let's just pause those deeper conversations for a little bit until we have more information. I think that's the best way to look at it. And then the other signing, look, Bogdan Bogdanović, let's be clear. It's a minimum signing, so you shouldn't have massive expectations. He's 33 years old. But as far as minimum signings go, this feels like a pretty good one that has a chance at paying off. Over his NBA career, which is now almost a decade in, he's averaged 14 points in 28 minutes per game, shooting better than 38% from three-point range. Now, he's played only sparingly the past year and a half or so with the Clippers, but that's been sort of an odd situation across the board. He's also had some unfortunate injuries. Not saying that he's 100% not washed. That's obviously the fear when a guy starts playing less in his early to mid-30s. I'm not saying 100% that he's the same player he always was, but he's had some ill-timed injuries, and it's not like his play has declined across the board for multiple teams. When it's basically a season and a half in one specific situation, it's easier to wonder if, hey, maybe the fit just wasn't right, or maybe he was just unlucky with injuries and he can bounce back somewhere else. And I do recall during the 2024 offseason, he was fantastic for Serbia in those Olympics. So he's been a very good bench shooter over his career. That's the role he'll be asked to take on in Houston, whereas we discussed leading off the pod, the Rockets have needed more three-point shooting for a while. On paper, it's low risk and I don't want to say high reward, but moderate reward. He's been a good rotation player over his career. Earlier this decade, he got 6 Man of the Year votes a couple of times. So, I mean, he's someone that can shoot at a high level and fill it up when he's hot. And that's something that this team needs. That's exactly what Ime Udoka talks about after the Lakers series, diversifying the end of the bench, having different types of players. This is not a Jayshawn Tate or Josh Okogie type that is a one-trick pony defensively. This is the opposite. This is someone that's, known for primarily shooting, but a little bit of playmaking as well. He can score the basketball when he's right. And at 33 years old, I mean, he could be on the decline, but there's also players that are that age and still themselves. And he's someone that's never been super dependent on his athleticism. He's relatively high IQ, so not saying for sure, but there's a path that he could age gracefully. He did not the last year and a half or so with the Clippers, but again, when it's just one team, I'm more open to it being extenuating circumstances. And if it's not, then it's just a minimum signing. And with you not being hard capped at the first apron, it's much easier to sort of swap him out for another minimum signing later on if you come to the conclusion that he just doesn't have it anymore. The other thing that I like about Bogdanović, he's someone that the Rockets have targeted for a while. During the season, if you recall, there was a weird period of a few weeks where we all wondered, are the Rockets going to sign someone from the buyout market, or are they going to convert J.D. Davison to a standard contract? When they had the open roster spot, they did have the money to add one more player to their roster, and ultimately they chose to convert J.D. Davison, which made him playoff eligible. And, it's hard to be too down on that decision because J.D. was a quality player last season. But I'm told that the reason that drug on a while and they didn't convert JD earlier, Bogdan was their target via the buyout market. And they had hoped to add into last season's team. And if they do, who knows? Maybe they beat the Lakers if those Jayshawn Tate minutes go to Bogdan instead and he's able to make those open threes. I don't know. We can certainly wonder about that. I bet game 3 in particular, Bogdan would have helped you in that series. But Bogdan, he wasn't willing to accept a buyout at that time. He thought about it because certainly he wasn't playing a lot with the Clippers and the Rockets would have given him a chance to compete at a much higher level. But there was a $16 million team option for this coming season. And at the time, Bogdan and his agent, I don't know if they considered it likely, but it was at least plausible that the team option might get picked up if the Clippers needed to match salary and trades. And so even if there's less certainty that way, because who knows where you're getting traded to, if you could make $16 million and not the league minimum of closer to 3, then of course you want to keep that path open. And that's why he didn't do a buyout last season, because he didn't want to pass up on that $16 million team option just in case it got picked up in one of these trade scenarios. Ultimately, it didn't. And the Clippers declined the team option because obviously they're not going to pay him $16 million if he's not playing a whole lot. And then he signed with the Rockets for the minimum. So as with Bruce Thornton, when the Rockets in the draft moved up and aggressively got their guy, I feel confident in saying that this is their guy. It's not just something that, well, it should be obvious. You sign him on night 1 of free agency. It's a target. But it goes deeper than that. This is someone they've had their eye on for a while. So I like that above all else, they went out and got their guy. Maybe they're wrong, not telling you that you should have a super high expectation for a minimum guy who was a minimum signing for a reason, but they made a move with conviction. So I tip my hat at least to that, and we'll see how it pans out. And it's not like the Rockets were the only team interested. It's been reported, and I've heard the same, that the Denver Nuggets really wanted Bogdan as well. They could have reunited him with Nikola Jokic, who they played together on that aforementioned Serbian Olympic team a couple of years ago, and so many Serbian teams over the years on the international stage. And the Rockets got the deal done in large part because they've built a relationship with Bogdan. He knew through back channels that the Rockets were an option if he was going to be bought out during the season. I'm told he feels very comfortable with Ime Udoka. So It's not as if the Rockets are on an island in believing that this guy might have something left in the tank. No, the Denver Nuggets, another team that's in that same bucket. Last year, there was the Spurs and Thunder at the top of the West, and then that group of four, the Nuggets, the Rockets, the Lakers, and the Timberwolves right behind. Another team in that group of four that was close in the standings all season long wanted the same player. So as far as minimum signings go, I have a tough time getting too worked up about this one. Not telling you for sure it's going to work, but I understand the logic. I think there's at least a moderately high payoff if he gets back to the guy that he was when he had his best years with the Atlanta Hawks. And right now, you have a 10-man rotation that looks pretty good. I think your starters project to be right now Fred, Kevin Durant, Amen Thompson, Jabari Smith Jr., and Alperen Şengün. Your backups include Reed Shepherd, Marcus Smart, Tari Eason, Bogdan, and Steven Adams. That's a good 10-man rotation. And then you've got more quality vets later on further down the bench. Mentioned Dorian Finney-Smith and Clint Capella. Maybe DFS bounces back this year, a year removed from the ankle surgery. You can hope for that. And if you keep him on the roster, which you now have the financial flexibility to do, it at least leaves the door open to that scenario where DFS bounces back. I've been told they really like Isaiah Crawford, the two-way from last year, and what he can potentially do. Bruce Thornton, this path gives you a much more clear path to being able to sign him, hopefully to a multi-year deal that gives you a lot of club control. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of options on that bench, and it doesn't look like a year ago when by the playoffs you were having to depend on Jae'Sean Tate and Jeff Green and players that were clearly limited. On paper, this feels like a pretty good team. Now, is it at the level of San Antonio or Oklahoma City? Again, I don't know that. And are the Rockets done this offseason? Not necessarily. I mean, I think they're certainly going to be open to bigger moves, and now they have the financial flexibility to pull them off. But I do think that they're okay with this as the status quo. Not saying they love it, not saying, oh, you're ready to go to war with the Spurs or the Thunder right now. But you're a better team than last season. I think, assuming relative health, it's definitely fair to say that. And you have the optionality to make other things happen down the line. I think as far as day one of free agency, that's a pretty good place to be. Anyway, I'll wrap this episode there. We'll talk more about how all the pieces fit together and some of the trade possibilities in future shows. Wanted this to be relatively quick hitting, just reaction to the news of the past 24 hours, which is the signings of Marcus Smart, most recently with the LA Lakers, and Bogdan Bogdanović, most recently of the LA Clippers. With that, I think we're done for today. If you want more content for the next show, the best place to hear from me is on social media. My handle is @BenDuBose. I'm on all the major platforms, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, you name it. Just search for Ben DuBose and I'm there. And then the show, the Rockets Launch Pod, if you go to LaunchPod790 on Twitter/X and hit the link tree in the bio, that's got all the links to support the show. Apple, Google, Spotify, subscribe, leave a 5-star review if you have not already. That's how we can keep looking good to our friends, partners, and sponsors like Clutch Fans, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790. Their links are on there as well. Their support makes this show possible and one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs out of the way, we're done. As always, I appreciate you guys and girls so much for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of the Rockets Launch Pod.